Hey everybody, we're out here on the deck where there's snow. Does that mean global warming isn't happening? No, of course not. We all know that weather patterns are far more complex than that, but putting together your climate change action plan doesn't have to be. Whew, going inside.
Hello, this is Celeste Caron, EVP for PR and Marketing for Net Zero Analysis and Design. And today we're going to talk about Climate Change Action Plan for Carbon Neutrality and how to put one together. So in this video, we'll be talking about why develop a Climate Change Action Plan, what a Climate Change Action Plan even is, and how to develop a Climate Change Action Plan. So first, let's talk about why. There are many reasons a company might want to do this, but amongst them, the fact that we're in the middle of a climate emergency. This fact is undisputed by most people. Every dollar in GDP is equal to about 1 pound of carbon dioxide release into the atmosphere. And everyone in business today should be concerned and consider carbon neutrality a business requirement. This quote comes from Stephen Watkins, who is CEO of Entrex Carbon Markets, and we will introduce Entrex a little bit later in this video as well. So as it currently stands, all publicly held companies are required to address their climate change risk in their annual report to their investors. However, they don't have a particular metric with which to address that, and we believe all publicly held companies should be required to address their compliance to the ISO 14001 standard with an environmental audit and their climate change action plan for carbon neutrality, that this should be standard operating procedure. Reporting it publicly increases customer and investor confidence. Privately held companies are addressing their climate change risk, but few of them, if any, are reporting their efforts publicly. They're not required to. And we believe privately held companies should also be required to address their compliance to ISO 14001 with an environmental audit and a climate change action plan for carbon neutrality. Again, reporting it publicly increases accountability and action visibility. Everyone can see what you're doing, and the public generally wants to see this happen. Clients come to us for two main reasons. Either they've already begun to address their carbon footprint and want to streamline their climate change action plan, or they're losing business to proactive companies because climate change action is not part of their business model and they have yet to address this issue. They are actively being told and surprised by the fact that they are not being awarded vendor positions to companies that want to see this happen. So why develop a climate change action plan? Market leadership. These are forward-thinking companies that are already doing this. This challenges competitors to keep up with you, addresses the public's frustration with corporate inertia regarding climate change action, and makes you responsible for generating trends. And people do look back and say, who started this? Or who was first on board? Company stability. It supports company stability because you end up with increased sales while responding to business risk or required regulations, which are coming. Those that are not in place, especially in the United States, will be coming. It is a proactive versus a reactive strategy. You're not scrambling if you've already got a plan in place. Market leaders have already completed Scope 1 and 2 audits and are discussing carbon neutrality with vendors and suppliers in preparation for Scope 3 audits. They are also Entrex market members in preparation for purchasing carbon credits in order to facilitate their carbon neutrality. So one of our market-leading clients is Silkwave Industries. They are our first carbon neutral client, and they're in Japan. Silkwave is also the first carbon neutral B Corp in Japan, which is setting a new standard for their industry.
シルクウェブ産業の小沢康夫です。この度気候変動問題対策のためカーボンニュートラリティを達成いたしました。その折にはネットゼロ分析とエントレックスカーボン市場には大変お世話になりましたこと、心より感謝いたします。
Part 2. What is a climate change action plan? So let's talk about definitions of some of the terms that we're going to run into. So what is carbon footprint and carbon intensity? What does carbon neutral mean? And what does net zero emissions mean? So your carbon footprint is the amount of carbon dioxide and other carbon compounds emitted due to the consumption of fossil fuels by a particular person, group, activity, or product. It takes everything into account. And that includes the manufacturing process, the use of it, the disposal of it. Carbon intensity. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, carbon intensity is the measure of CO2 produced per dollar of GDP. Carbon neutral. Pertaining to or having achieved a state in which the net amount of carbon dioxide or other carbon compounds emitted into the atmosphere is reduced to zero because it is balanced by actions to reduce or offset these emissions, according to dictionary.com. So there are several internationally accepted metrics for carbon neutrality. There are very specific definitions that the international community accepts and works under. One is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. And the other is ISO's definition, their standard definition of carbon neutrality and net zero emissions is in their 14060 standard. So achieving carbon neutrality, how do we know what is carbon neutral? How do we know that we've achieved it? So we're going to look to ISO and their definition. So your carbon neutrality plan is based on your ISO 14001-2015 Scope 1 and 2 audit results and how your company plans to become carbon neutral. So carbon neutral and beyond. We're going to talk about two different levels of climate change action. One is carbon neutrality, and we're talking about a multifaceted approach to carbon neutrality with a set target date for the company to be carbon neutral. The other is a plan for net zero emissions, and this is where the company supply chain and the company are both carbon neutral. So this is your scope 3, reaching down to your vendors and your supply chain for net zero emissions status. So internationally accepted metrics for carbon neutrality. Market-leading companies are pledged carbon neutral by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2040. And this is to the ISO 14000 and 14001 standards. So let's talk about some common myths. There are a lot of people that believe that energy efficiency can get you to carbon neutrality or is the same as carbon neutrality, and that renewable energy is a net zero emissions energy. And those things are not true. We'll cover that more in depth in another video as to why, but those two things are not necessarily the case.
Thanks for watching. Please like our video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Climate Action Plan, Carbon Neutrality. Net Zero Analysis is carbon neutral and pledges to be net zero emissions by 2030.